Here is the Mossad's man who trained Osama bin Laden. His name is Ali Muhammad, and he was the first trainer of al-Qaeda. He's the one who trained Osama bin Laden and al-Zawahiri. He's the one who set up the bombing of the U.S. embassies in Africa. And he was involved in all the al-Qaeda terrorist activities in the 1980s, like the USS Cole and the African bombings. And what happened is that the United States then held him in a trial, put him in a trial for the bombing of the embassies in Africa, and he was found guilty. And then he was put away in American state penitentiary, federal penitentiary for life or something like that. And then he just disappeared. He's completely disappeared. He disappeared from the American judicial system. He disappeared from the federal penitentiary system like thin. Here, gone.
And what's interesting, government were responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union collapsed like a house of cards because it was a house of cards. It rotted away from within. The economy was rotten. The political process was rotten. They had developed a central government that was no longer believed by people outside of Moscow. There was total cynicism throughout the Soviet system of governance. There was no real civil society. But the Reagan administration and the minions of the Reagan administration will tell you that Afghanistan led to a collapse of the Soviet Union itself, the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the East European Empire. We were saying that this was entirely fanciful, and the United States missed all of this because they believed their own myths and their own fanciful notions. They had become their own victims of their own lies.
Although the new Russian bear seems less intimidating, it's also less inhibited. With the borders now open, Russian crime has slipped its leash and gone transnational. Semir Mogilevich moved west from Moscow to Prague. Here, the collapse of communism 10 years ago left a vacuum. As the Velvet Revolutionaries threw away the hated implements of dictatorship, they left themselves vulnerable to the new crime infection from the east. The Russians soon made their presence felt.
They were involved in a very wide spectrum of organized crime, ranging from racketeering to arms smuggling, attempts to smuggle radioactive nuclear materials, all activities connected with organized crime.
The biggest rip-off in the new unfettered world of Klondike capitalism involved multi-million-dollar rackets in oils and petrols. About a third of all the petrol and diesel pumped into their fuel tanks by Czech motorists went untaxed. The trick was that whereas light fuel oil in the Republic was not taxable, diesel drew a heavy excise duty. So the Russian mafia used various frauds to make massive rip-offs. Sometimes the real rail tanker oil identities were carefully disguised, or the actual oil inside the tankers was chemically adulterated to change its true characteristics. This huge racket robbed the Czech government of enough revenue to build 50 brand new hospitals.
They're very intelligent. A lot of them have, master's degrees. And they love frauds, because they'll go right after the government, which is the biggest money producer around. So they can generate huge amounts of money real fast.
And with those vast profits came the violence and the car bombings as the Russians and Czechs fought turf wars for domination of the oil rackets. Winners took all, losers paid with their lives. By May 1995, Prague had become crime heaven for Russian gangsters. The Godfathers, feeling safe and confident here, decided to hold a rare Russian crime summit to celebrate successes and plan a profitable future.
And for the Islamists too, a great myth was born out of the struggle in Afghanistan, that it was they who had conquered the Soviet Union. The Islamists believed that this great victory would start a revolution that would sweep across the Arab world and topple the corrupt leaders. But as with the neoconservatives, this dream was built on an illusion.
The Islamists were convinced
that they were the key instruments in the demise of the Soviet army in Afghanistan. They just would not like to remember that without U.S. military help and training, they couldn't have done anything, and also that the Afghans were the ones who ousted the Soviets, not the Arab jihadis who didn't really fight. They were trained, but they were not the fighters. But the myth has it that they were the ones who won. I mean, this was jihad that had triumphed. This was something very powerful that was a mobilizing force for Islamists worldwide.
But there was a deep rift within the Islamist fighters based in Peshawar, between the moderates, led by Abdullah Azam, who believed this revolution could be accomplished politically, and the extremists, like Ayman Zawahiri, who saw violent revolution as the only way. And Zawahiri now set out to extend his influence over the movement and to undermine Abdullah Azam. To do this, he seduced Osama bin Laden and his money away from Azam. He promised bin Laden that he could become the emir, the leader of Zawahiri's small extremist group, Islamic Jihad.
Ayman Zawahiri and another group of Egyptians, they refused to pray behind Abdullah Azam in Peshawar. They used to create rumors in Peshawar against Abdullah Azam. That's why we became angry about Osama, why he closed these people to him. They accepted him as an emir, and they accepted them as a group. Finally, I don't know who did use the other. What do you think? I think the other used him. Because he had the money? Yes.
Then, at the end of 1989, Abdullah Azam was assassinated by a huge car bomb in Peshawar. It is still unknown who carried out the assassination. But despite his death, it seemed as if Azam's vision of a political revolution might prevail. In the early 90s, in countries across the Arab world, Islamist parties began to gather mass support. In Algeria, the Islamic Salvation Front won overwhelming victories in local elections and looked certain to win the coming general election. And at the same time in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood began to win mass support and a growing number of seats in parliament. Both parties were riding to power on an idealistic vision. They would use Islam in a political way to create a new type of model society through peaceful means.
Gone. And what's interesting about this fella is that he was a Hebrew-speaking double agent. Supposedly Egyptian, yet he spoke fluent Hebrew. So he's obviously some sort of triple agent working for the Israelis as well. And you have to understand that when Israeli military intelligence started training the al-Qaeda people in Pakistan, the people who became al-Qaeda, they had to have Arabic-speaking trainers. And that's not a problem for Israel because there's many, many Israelis who were born in places like Morocco or Iraq who speak the language and can appear to be Iraqi or Moroccan or Egyptian very well, but are in fact Israelis. And so Ali Muhammad and the Israelis trained these characters who became al-Qaeda. First they were members of the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group, and then when they lost Saudi support, after they supported Saddam Hussein in 1991, and they lost Pakistani support in 1994, all of that group that the Israelis had trained merged into al-Qaeda and Taliban. And of course, al-Qaeda then morphed into ISIS, what we're fighting today.
We will continue, God permitting, the fight against the Israelis and their allies, and will not give up a single inch of Palestine as long as there is one true Muslim on earth. Bin Laden calls it the prime issue and the most important reason of the conflict between what he calls our civilization and yours.
US Navy commandos last year. Now we're getting a glimpse of the so-called treasure trove of documents grabbed from that compound. In a US election year, Washington has chosen to release a fraction of the 6,000 documents. The bin Laden files reveal that he tasked two groups with the mission of anticipating and spotting the visits of President Obama or General Petraeus to Afghanistan or Pakistan to target the aircraft of either one of them. They are not, he said, to target visits by US Vice President Biden. Bin Laden's plan was for Joe Biden to take over as president, believing he was incompetent and would lead the US into crisis.
Every insurgent looks at his adversary and tries to figure out how can you conduct a military strike that has operational significance, but even more importantly, has enormous political significance. Terrorism or insurgency is at its heart a political contest as opposed to a military contest.
So he's now saying Israel is the central issue, which is a bit of a shift.
It is a shift. In the last year or two, he's begun to make that the central issue. Initially, it was U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia, U.S. forces on the Muslim lands. Now it's become... He's shifted his message to try to continue his appeal.
Israeli radio is reporting that senior sources say there was a credible threat from Osama bin Laden, that there would be a major series of attacks, unprecedented attacks, not only on American interests, but also on British ones. That's the Israeli version of that story. And we do know also that journalists in London who have had close contact with Osama bin Laden, Arab journalists, say that he made this claim also to them, that he would carry out a series of spectacular attacks of the kind never seen before. So that report is being treated here with some seriousness by the Israeli defense establishment.
Later on in the hour, tips for stretching out your vagina without having a baby.
But first, in today's tough economic times, money stresses can really be overwhelming.
Yeah, but help is on the way. Author Christine Eckert is here to show us some exercises to reduce stress. Hi, Christine.
Good morning.
Hi, Jim and Tracy. Christine, I'm so glad you're here. I'm about ready to snap.
She is.
The first thing we're going to learn about is problem visualization.
Okay.
It's a simple method for reducing stress by assigning an image to represent your anxiety.
Well, that sounds simple enough.
Okay, the first thing I like to do is imagine my money-related stress as the most disgusting, terrifying creature I can think of. To imagine an ugly, greasy little creature with a hooked nose and oily black hair.
Oh, he is scary.
I call him the Grabbler because he's a greedy little monster who wants to grabble up all my money.
Ooh.
Now close your eyes and picture the Grabbler.
Okay, there he
Now
is.
think of all the problems your Grabbler is causing. He invented interest rates like the ones on your credit card.
Oh.
He's taking the jobs because Grabblers only hire their own kind. I just want to get rid of him. Now imagine the Grabbler slowly disintegrating like a pile of ashes blown away by a purifying wind. And now you're in a peaceful meadow full of lilies swaying in a gentle breeze. They're not scheming or trying to rob me.
Oh, that really works.
Ooh, what a relief. I feel so relaxed.
Now, this image visualization works for other kinds of stresses besides money, right?
Say you had an argument with someone at work. Take that social stress and visualize it being due to a blabbler.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked. Unbelievable. Right, that's the view from the Palestinian side. Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World. First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. It's an attack against our whole civilization. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. If it is a kind of bin Laden organization, and even if it's something else, I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and
Russia against all sources of terror. The same kind of struggle that our forefathers launched against the piracy on the high seas.
In your